Ministry to Children in Crisis, Module 7, Disenfranchised Grief, Attending to Our Ghosts of Loss. Module 7 Learning Objectives. Number 1, to define and describe the term disenfranchised grief. Number 2, to discuss 3 reasons why childhood grief can be disenfranchised. Number 3, outline 3 needs of bereaved children. But number 4, following the viewing of Frederick Buechner's The Man in the Gray Slacks, I want you to view, there are 2 videos here. They're parts 1 and 2. I want you to be able to discuss this video as it relates to disenfranchised grief in a forum, but you will want to pay very close attention to this particular video. The definition of disenfranchised grief is as follows from Kenneth Doka's book, Disenfranchised Grief, Recognizing Hidden Sorrow. He states it this way: disenfranchised grief occurs when there is a loss of a meaningful and significant attachment that may not be recognized or validated by others. The grief subsequently experienced is then disenfranchised. The loss cannot be openly acknowledged, socially validated, or publicly mourned. He goes on to say, there are circumstances, however, in which a person experiences a sense of loss but does not have a socially recognized right or role or capacity to grieve. In these cases, the grief is seen to be disenfranchised. The person suffers a loss but has little or no opportunity to publicly mourn. Some examples of disenfranchised grief includes the following: the unacknowledged grief in prenatal death, stillbirth, or miscarriage. Sometimes there is no ritual for these. It's important that we recognize that, and when we can, to be able to help in these situations. What about an ex-spousal death? Maybe the griever doesn't feel like they're able to grieve adequately, even though there is a loss of what could have been or would have been, or the relationship will never ever be mended in this case, for sure. Estranged family members, for example, grandparents or siblings that for some reason or another are apart from the family, live a great distance, either emotionally or geographically, and some of the family members may want to be able to grieve but don't feel like they are permitted to do so. What about pet loss? So it's very important with children. It's also important with all of us, especially the elderly, who it may be the last pet that the couple had together. It might be a puppy or dog and or cat, and then that was that last bit of attachment with that loved one. So there's a particular complexity about the loss of a pet in that case. But at any rate, we need to recognize that this is a loss that people do have. Relationships not socially sanctioned. For example, a homosexual relationship that maybe a relationship is a taboo within this family, and a person doesn't feel like they can adequately grieve or it's not recognized? What about an extramarital relationship or cohabiting couples that don't have, any legal rights in this relationship? Yet the grief is still real. Nursing home roommates. I know when my mother was in the nursing home prior to her death, she had several roommates. She'd go to dinner and come back from dinner, and her roommate would be gone. Bed would be stripped. And though she had Alzheimer's, she did recognize there was something different about the room, and it was upsetting to her. We really don't recognize nursing home roommates as a loss of those who are survivors. Abortion. People do experience all kinds of emotions following an abortion, and not much is said or done for those who choose to abort a child. What about a death of a coworker? We usually don't do a whole lot about that. Maybe they'll have a counselor, maybe they won't, if it's a larger company. But we're told to just keep going going on to work, going on with the job, even though somebody that sat in the cubicle next to you, their desk is empty, their chair is empty. Suicides. This is that perhaps unspeakable secret that the family doesn't want anyone to know about. Loss of a boyfriend or girlfriend is very real when you're a teenager. And as parents, we would do well to recognize the loss that exists emotionally. Losses by the very old or very young. Sometimes we think, well, they really don't know what's going on, so we just don't talk about it with them or discuss it. In all of these cases, the usual sources of support may not be available or helpful. Disenfranchised grief can be defined as the grief that persons experience when they incur a loss that is not or cannot be openly acknowledged, publicly mourned, or socially supported, according to DOCA. Dr. Alan Wolfelt utilizes the term ghost of grief whenever he's referring to disenfranchised grief. It's not exactly a synonym, but Wolfelt says that we carry this grief that are like ghosts that are hidden in us, that create all sorts of trouble psychologically, emotionally, and sometimes physiologically, as we carry that with us through our lives if we don't deal with it earlier in life. He says this: many people are living in the shadow of the ghosts of grief. The person living in the shadow often has symptoms that suggest that the pain of grief has been inhibited, delayed, converted, or avoided altogether. He says, I also use the term carried grief to describe unacknowledged or unmourned grief. He continues, when you experience loss but do not mourn the normal or necessary resulting feelings of grief, you carry that grief forward into the future. This carried grief results in a muting of one's spirit or divine spark, or what Meister Eckhart describes as, quote, that which gives depth and purpose to our living, end quote. And when the spirit is muted, there is an ongoing hampering of your ability to love your life with meaning and purpose. It's taken from Wolfelt's book, Living in the Shadows of Ghosts of Grief, Step into the Light. And I would recommend that book to you if you want to learn more about this particular subject. There are three reasons why disenfranchised grief occurs. And the concept of disenfranchised grief recognizes that societies have sets of norms, in effect, grieving rules that attempt to specify who, when, where, how long, and for whom people should grieve. These grieving rules may even be codified in personnel policies in one's employment contract. For example, a worker may be allowed a week off for the death of a spouse or a child, 3 days for the loss of a parent or sibling, but no time off allowed for other losses, such as extended family members or others such as co-workers with whom one may have spent many years working alongside. Such policies reflect societal definitions as to who has a legitimate right to grieve, which usually includes familial relationships. However, this may not correspond to the nature of attachments, the sense of loss, or feelings of certain others who are survivors as well. The grief of these other survivors is disenfranchised. In our society, this may occur for three reasons. Number one, the relationship is not recognized. Doka states, in our society, most attention is placed on kin-based relationships and roles. Grief may be disenfranchised in these situations in which the relationship between the bereaved and the deceased is not based on a recognizable kinship tie. Many times, the roles of lovers, friends, neighbors, foster parents, colleagues, in-laws, step-parents and stepchildren, caregivers, counselors, co-workers, and roommates, as I said earlier, for example, in nursing homes, those relationships may be long-lasting and intensely interactive. But even though these relationships are recognized, mourners may not have a full opportunity to publicly grieve a loss. At most, they may be expected to support and assist those who are family members. One may mourn the loss of what once was or what might have been. For example, in one case, a 12-year-old child of an unwed mother, never even acknowledged or seen by the father, still mourned the death of his father since it ended any possibility of a future liaison. But though the loss is experienced, society as a whole may not perceive that the loss of a past relationship could or should cause any reaction. Second reason for disenfranchised grief is that the loss is not recognized. Perinatal deaths lead to strong grief reactions. However, research indicates that many significant others still perceive the loss to be relatively minor. Society rarely has rituals to mourn such losses, even though they're very real to the family, especially to the mother. Abortion, which can take place without the knowledge or sanctions of others, or even recognize that a loss has occurred, is still very real. What about pet loss? The loss of a pet may bring profound reactions to loss, since there are strong ties between pets and humans. Friends and family may minimize the loss experienced. Consider a child or an elderly loss of this faithful companion, how traumatic that can be for them. There are certain losses that are not socially validated, which may be considered a social death. This occurs when an object of loss remains physically alive, but treated as if they were dead. An example may include those who are institutionalized or in a comatose state, and what person was there is not there any longer. Their being is considered dead, but they're still alive. What about losses that are considered psychological deaths? When, for instance, a person may be considered brain dead. In this case, a person lacks the consciousness of existence but is biologically alive. What about those that might be considered psychosocial deaths, in which a person has changed so drastically through mental illness or organic brain syndromes or other personal transformations such as drug or alcohol addiction, we say they're not the same anymore. That significant others perceive the person as he or she previously existed as being dead. They're not the same person that they were before. In such cases, where the reality of the loss is not socially validated, as in the last three, spouses and others may experience a profound sense of loss of what was, and that loss cannot be publicly acknowledged, for the person is still biologically alive. Number 3, the griever is not recognized. Both the very old and the very young are typically perceived by others as having little comprehension of or reaction to the death of a significant other. Often, then, both young children and aged adults are excluded from both discussions and sometimes even the rituals of the deceased. Mentally disabled persons are often seen as incapable of grasping or understanding the concept of death. Studies affirm, however, that this group not only is able to understand the concept of death, but also to experience grief. Remember, we talked in our last module that if a person is old enough to love, they're old enough to grieve. But because a person is mentally retarded or mentally challenged or otherwise mentally disabled, others in the family may ignore his or her need to grieve. A teacher of a mentally disabled children described two instances of this type of disenfranchised grief. She talks about Susie, who was 17 years old when away at summer camp when her father died. The family felt that she wouldn't understand and that it would be better for her not to come home early for the funeral. Francine was with her mother when she got sick, and the mother was taken away by ambulance. Nobody responded to her questions or told her what had happened. After all, they responded, "She's retarded." These two instances remind us that this group can be highly disenfranchised in their grief, and they're going to experience grief. Imagine the girl coming home from camp and the dad wasn't there anymore. She would be missing him. Or the mother who got sick whenever she was present and didn't come home. Certainly, it behooves us as caregivers, as adults, that care for these people. May not understand completely, but they certainly understand the loss, and we can be there and be present in helping to answer their questions. I want to talk about disenfranchised grief in young children. Rather than protecting the child from some supposed trauma, this approach in each case leaves the child unprotected from potentially negative consequences of delayed, restrained, or unresolved grief. The child is also left vulnerable to negative conditions that can appear later in adulthood and are associated with unresolved grief, according to Doka. We talked about in previous discussions of the importance of addressing these needs, that being overly protective and not wanting to concern the child, or overprotective of the pain that they might experience. It actually heightens their anxiety and isn't helpful at all. Two examples in which families disenfranchise the young children from their grief and mourning are seen, first of all, in one concerning Michael. Michael and his grandfather had been the best of friends, pals really, since Michael was born. Grandpa lived upstairs and Michael and his parents lived downstairs in the same house. But when Michael was about 7 years old, he and his parents moved several miles away, assuring Grandpa they would see him on Thanksgiving Day. Well, that day came, and then Christmas came, but Grandpa didn't come, or call, or send a card. Michael's parents explained that Grandpa was away. Michael was filled with torturing questions. What had he done to Grandpa? Didn't Grandpa love him? What was the matter? And 2 years later, Michael's parents told him that Grandpa had died soon after they moved. Imagine how Michael would be distrustful as he grew older, that his parents didn't trust that information with him, didn't share that with him. It would be harmful to him rather than helpful. As was said before, that kind of disenfranchisement creates, or protectionism is iatrogenic in nature. It is more harmful than it is good for the child. Second example is that of Jerry, who's now 20, recalls that when his grandmother died when he was a young child, right away his parents sent him across the street to stay with a neighbor and kept him there until after the funeral. He could not understand why he was exiled and not allowed to be with his family or see his grandmothers. He thought then that she must look terrible. No one talked with him about anything. Both of these examples, Michael and Jerry, were disenfranchised from their grieving and mourning by probably caring and misguided parents, however. Bereaved children typically ponder some frightening questions like, is it my fault? Did I do it, or did I cause it? And who will take care of me now? And will I die? Death-related objects and events are all around, each a potential object of curiosity and a learning opportunity for the child. A dead pet, a dead animal on the road, funeral procession on the street, wilted plants, buds of spring, leaves of fall, the talk of adults about death. Certain television shows can lend themselves to discussion, and so much more. So as adults, we need to be aware of those teachable moments in which we can share about death and dying with our children in open and honest ways. All of these are opportunities for adults to engage the child in dialogue, helping the child to explore, to ask questions, and to learn. One study found that Bereaved children who were experienced in talking about death before a parent died were more able to handle the death than were children who had not had that opportunity. This is according to Dr. Doka. Well, how can adults help children who grieve? We'll talk about the needs of bereaved children. By not allowing children to ask their death-related questions, to receive thoughtful and understandable responses, to know why people are sad and crying, to participate in family funeral activities, and to express their emotions is intolerable folly. Doka says, children may, in the absence of knowledge, invent facts and stories more terrifying than the reality itself. So in talking with children, look at 3 ways in which adults around these children can help their understanding surrounding a death event of a loved one. 3 ways that adults can help. Number 1, finding out the levels of thinking and expressing of which the child is capable and meet the child on their level. So understanding those developmental stages, as we talked about last module. So this comes with educating oneself and understanding those developmental stages of children in general and with each child specifically. So educating oneself. Number 2, proceed slowly and periodically and check with the child to find out what he or she has heard. Using good communication skills, one may determine if the child has overheard adults talking and perhaps have some misinformation about the deceased or about the event. So the point here is to clarify one's understanding of what has been heard. So clarification with the child. And 3, remember to not give an explanation based on deceit or fantasy, since a child will later have to relearn an accurate explanation anyway. So we want to be careful of euphemisms used to describe death, such as Grandpa's on a long trip or Mommy went to sleep and didn't wake up. No, we don't want to use that. Use those words. Sick, dead, dying, to clarify exactly what is going on with the family member or the loved one. An example of not using euphemisms or a way not to talk with children is found in this story of a mother who died, and the father explained to their young child, Mommy got very tired and her body got so tired she went to sleep and she won't wake up anymore. So from then on, when the father came home from work tired and weary, he'd sit in his chair and maybe doze off in the chair, child would become very upset. She was terrified that she or anyone could become so tired as to fall asleep and not ever awaken. The child refused to do anything she thought might make her tired. Eventually, the father had to replace the first explanation with an accurate one and to work with the child to help her unlearn the first one. So, if it would have been clear that Mommy got sick and Mommy died, then, it would have been clear to the child, and she wouldn't have to unlearn the first one and learn the real truth. Family members would do well to remember that when a child loses one parent, a child loses, in some ways, the other parent too. The surviving parent gets lost in his or her own grief and may not be psychologically available to the child, at least for a while. And so that's why it's important, as we stated in earlier modules, it's okay to bring in family members when we're dealing with our own stuff of grief. Bring in an aunt or an uncle or a grandmother, or sister or brother to help out, to kind of create a buffer as we're dealing with our own stuff. So I'd like for you to stop at this point, and there are two videos. It's really one video divided into two. It's Frederick Buechner's presentation at Trinity Church, I believe it was in New York, several years ago. His description of his personal story of the death of his father is a very tragic death. It's entitled "The Man in the Gray Slacks." So view parts 1 and 2 that are in your activities, and those will be discussed in a forum. So I want you to view the comments and contribute to that discussion. But after you view the videos and contributed to the discussion of the forum, then we'll have some closing thoughts in this module before we conclude. Closing reflections about disenfranchised grief. Just kind of a summary. Number 1, people exist in multiple relationships and have a tremendous capacity to form meaningful, significant, and multifaceted attachments in their environment. People form a web of significant attachments that include not only family, but also friends and colleagues and caregivers. Human attachments can include pets, whose loss can bring grief, but also many aspects of their environment. Maybe a move, loss of a home, perhaps a fire, or just a move, the loss of some possessions, jobs, organizations, ideals, dreams, beliefs, all are included. So we have multifaceted attachments. So it behooves us to be in tune to family members, especially children, and what they might have attachments to. Number 2, we may need to broaden our definitions of loss. Since people are capable of diverse sets of attachments, it seems necessary that as a society we need to broaden our definition of what constitutes a loss, being careful of one's bias as to whose grief is legitimate and whose is not. So as we're learning today in this course, we at least can be more in tune to those around us and the types of losses that may not be seen as legitimate by society or cultural mores, but that you and I can be more aware of the different attachments and minister to people in ways that they otherwise may not be ministered to. Number 3, in counseling the disenfranchised, we need to validate their loss as legitimate. Certainly goes in hand with number 2. But because of the societal values, the griever often views their loss as illegitimate and inappropriate themselves. As caregivers, we can assist in helping to explore one's loss more fully. There is a caveat, however, that one must understand that grief over the loss of one's pet, though legitimate, may also be the manifestation of earlier unresolved loss as well. So where a family member may not have been able to or didn't seem to grieve the loss of perhaps another loved one, like a spouse, whenever that shared pet dies, they may be grieving seemingly uncontrollably And we wonder all of that over a pet. But it wasn't just about the pet, you see. It was about the last attachment that they had together as a couple. So we can try to be more aware of those manifestations that trigger earlier losses that they may have been incapable or unwilling to grieve that comes up at a subsequent loss. Number 4, rituals are critical tools for the resolution of grief. Though the disenfranchised griever may not feel free to express their grief, to mourn publicly by being absent or excluded from funeral services or other rituals, this does not preclude participation in personalized, significant, and meaningful therapeutic and post-funeral rituals. There may also be opportunities to join a grief support group as societal awareness changes concerning individuals who need ways of coping with their loss. So there are some post-funeral services or post-funeral rituals that could be had. Maybe, whether it's planting of a tree or writing of a letter or visiting a funeral plot or a memorial. We could do that later on as a family or as an individual to help us to work through our grief process. Well, this concludes Module 7. And the learning objectives for this module, first of all, I want you to be able to define and describe the term disenfranchised grief in your own words. To be able to discuss 3 reasons why childhood grief can be disenfranchised. We talked about those. I want to outline 3 needs of bereaved children, as we talked about. And then you'll want to join in the forum, if you haven't already, to join in the forum of Frederick Buechner's The Man in the Gray Slacks as it relates to disenfranchised grief. There are a lot of other things that we could discuss about Buechner's story. You may want to talk briefly about some of those importance of sharing secrets, things like that. But I particularly want you to hone in on how this relates to our study of this in this module of disenfranchised grief, and how it relates to how we minister to children in particular. Until next time, God bless. Have a great day.